The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains as the transcontinental train screeched to a halt just outside Fort Bridger, Wyoming in the summer of 1869. Josephine Grayson clutched her valise tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather as she peered anxiously through the soot-stained window. This wasn't the welcome she had expected when she'd left Philadelphia 3 days ago, heading west to start her new life. The conductor rushed through the passenger car, his face flushed with panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and in your seats. There appears to be some trouble ahead." Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. At 22, she had never encountered anything more dangerous than her father's disapproval of her decision to accept a teaching position in Wyoming territory. Now, as shouts erupted outside the train, she wondered if perhaps he had been right about the untamed West. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback, bandanas pulled up over their faces, pistols drawn. They weren't shooting at the train, they were commanding it to stay put. The locomotive had already surrendered, billowing steam into the clear blue sky as if sighing in resignation. "Everyone stay where you are," the conductor shouted, but his words were drowned out by the sound of boots stomping onto the metal steps of the passenger car. The door crashed open. 3 men entered, their eyes cold beneath the shadow of their hats. The tallest of them stepped forward, sweeping his gaze across the frightened passengers until his eyes locked on Josephine. "That one," he said, pointing directly at her. "The schoolmarm." Josephine froze. How did they know who she was? She had written ahead to the town council about her arrival, but surely that information wasn't public knowledge. "Come along, miss," the second man said, moving toward her. "You'll be coming with us instead of going to Fort Bridger." "I most certainly will not," Josephine said, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. "I am expected in town. The children can wait." The third man interrupted with a chuckle that sent chills down her spine. "Our employer wants a word with you first." The first man reached for her arm, and Josephine jerked away, backing against the window. The other passengers shrank in their seats, no one willing to intervene. "Please," she whispered. "I don't understand." The commotion at the front of the car drew everyone's attention. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the brightness outside. He stepped in, and Josephine could see him clearly now, a man in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but there was something commanding in his stance. "What's the meaning of this?" the newcomer asked, his voice deep and steady. "None of your business, mister," the tallest kidnapper replied. "This doesn't concern you." The stranger's hand rested casually near the holster at his hip. "I believe it does. You're detaining a train full of innocent folks, and that young lady doesn't look eager to join your company." "She's coming with us," the second man insisted, taking a step toward Josephine. "We have orders." The newcomer moved with surprising quickness, positioning himself between Josephine and the 3 men. "She's already spoken for," he announced, his voice carrying throughout the car. "The schoolteacher is under the protection of Fort Bridger and its citizens." Josephine stared at the back of her unexpected defender, noting the way his shoulders tensed beneath his faded shirt. He was prepared for violence if it came to that. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy," the tallest man warned. "Am I?" The stranger nodded toward the window. Outside, riders were approaching, at least a dozen of them, all wearing badges that caught the sunlight. The town sheriff had gotten word of trouble on the tracks. The 3 would-be kidnappers exchanged glances. Their advantage was quickly disappearing. "This isn't over," the tall one muttered, backing toward the door. "Tell Lancaster he can't protect her forever." They retreated hastily, and moments later, the sound of galloping horses faded into the distance. The passengers began to murmur in relief, but Josephine remained frozen, staring at her rescuer as he turned to face her. "Are you all right, Miss Grayson?" he asked, removing his hat to reveal sun-lightened brown hair. "How do you know my name?" she asked, still clutching her valise like a shield. "I'm Matthew Irwin, miss. I was sent by the town council to escort you safely to Fort Bridger." He offered a small, reassuring smile, though I didn't expect to start the job quite this dramatically. Outside, the sheriff and his men surrounded the train. The conductor was explaining the situation, gesturing wildly toward the horizon where the three men had disappeared. "Who were they? What did they want with me?" Josephine asked, finding her voice at last. Matthew glanced toward the open door, then back to her. "That's something better discussed once we reach town. The train will continue to Fort Bridger under escort now." He held out his hand. "If you'll trust me, Miss Grayson, I promise to explain everything once you're safe." Josephine hesitated only briefly before accepting his outstretched hand. His grip was firm yet gentle, calloused from work but somehow comforting. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt she could trust this stranger who had placed himself between her and danger without hesitation. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin," she said softly. "Just doing my duty, miss," he replied, though something in his eyes suggested it was more than that. "Welcome to Wyoming territory." The train resumed its journey with a posse of armed men riding alongside. Josephine returned to her seat, but Matthew Irwin remained standing in the aisle beside her, his vigilant gaze fixed on the landscape rushing past. She studied him surreptitiously, wondering what kind of man would risk his life for a woman he'd never met. And more importantly, she wondered why anyone would want to kidnap a simple schoolteacher from Philadelphia. The remainder of the journey to Fort Bridger passed without incident. As the train pulled into the small station, Josephine caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The town wasn't large, but it was bustling with activity, the trading post that had given the settlement its start, surrounded by newer wooden buildings that had sprung up as the railroad brought more settlers west. Matthew escorted Josephine from the train, carrying her trunk while she clutched her smaller valise. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a silver-streaked mustache, approached them immediately. "Miss Grayson, I'm Sheriff Tanner. I apologize for the trouble on your journey." "Rest assured we'll get to the bottom of it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Josephine replied. "Mr. Irwin was just about to explain why those men might have been after me." The sheriff exchanged a look with Matthew. "Perhaps that conversation should wait until you're settled at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. She's expecting you." Matthew nodded in agreement. "The sheriff's right. You've had a difficult journey and you should rest. I'll escort you to the boarding house and we can speak later." Josephine wanted to protest, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her. The adrenaline that had kept her alert was now fading, leaving her drained. She nodded her assent, and they made their way down the town's main street. Fort Bridger wasn't what Josephine had imagined. Despite its frontier status, the town had a sense of permanence about it. Solid buildings lined the street, and people nodded respectfully as they passed. Several children paused in their play to stare curiously at her, no doubt wondering if this was their new teacher. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was a two-story white structure with green shutters and a welcoming porch. The proprietress herself, a plump woman with kind eyes, emerged as they approached. "Miss Grayson, we've been so worried when we heard about the trouble on the line. Come in, come in. I've prepared your room and there's hot water for washing up." She ushered Josephine inside, casting a questioning glance at Matthew. "I'll return this evening if that's acceptable," Matthew said to Josephine. "After you've had time to rest." Josephine nodded, suddenly reluctant to let him go. His presence had become a comfort in this strange new place. "Yes, please do. I have many questions." Matthew tipped his hat and turned to leave, but not before Josephine caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Concern, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her heart skip a beat despite her exhaustion. Mrs. Holloway showed her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "It's not what you're used to in Philadelphia, I expect, but we've tried to make it homey." The room was indeed pleasant, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a small writing desk by the window, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. A bouquet of wildflowers sat in a jar on the windowsill, their vibrant colors a welcome sight after days of travel. "It's lovely, Mrs. Holloway." "Thank you." Once alone, Josephine washed away the dust of travel and changed into a fresh dress. She unpacked a few essentials, including a framed photograph of her parents. Her father's stern face stared back at her, and she could almost hear his warnings about the dangers of the frontier. For the first time since leaving home, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Holloway stood there with a tray of food. "You must be famished, dear. Eat something, then rest. That handsome Mr. Irwin will be back before you know it." Josephine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "He's just doing his duty, Mrs. Holloway." The older woman's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she simply placed the tray on the desk and left Josephine to her meal. After eating, Josephine lay down on the bed, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. Instead, she fell into a deep sleep, dreams filled with galloping horses and a pair of steady blue eyes that promised protection. She woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Night had fallen, and for a moment, she was disoriented. Then memory flooded back: the train, the attempted kidnapping, Matthew Irwin standing between her and danger. Quickly smoothing her hair and straightening her dress, Josephine made her way downstairs. In the small parlor, Matthew sat with Sheriff Tanner and an older gentleman she didn't recognize. They rose as she entered. "Miss Grayson," Matthew said, "I hope you were able to rest. This is Judge Wilson, head of our town council." The judge, a dignified man with a neatly trimmed white beard, bowed slightly. "Miss Grayson, welcome to Fort Bridger. I only wish your arrival had been less eventful." "As do I, Judge Wilson." Josephine took the seat Matthew offered, facing the three men. "Now, I believe I'm owed an explanation about what happened today." The men exchanged glances before Sheriff Tanner spoke. "Miss Grayson, what do you know about Edward Lancaster?" Josephine frowned. "The name means nothing to me, should it?" "Lancaster owns the largest cattle operation in the territory," Matthew explained. "His land borders Fort Bridger to the north and east. He's been trying to expand his holdings for years, often using methods that skirt the law." "But what does that have to do with me?" Judge Wilson leaned forward. "The town has been working to establish itself as more than just a trading post or way station. We want families to settle here, to build a community. The school is central to that vision. And Lancaster doesn't want that," Matthew continued. "A proper town with law and education threatens his control of the region. He prefers to deal with transient traders and soldiers who won't challenge his authority. So he tried to kidnap me to prevent the school from opening," Josephine asked incredulously. "That seems extreme." "Lancaster doesn't do anything by half measures," the sheriff said grimly. "We suspected he might try something when he learned we'd hired a teacher from back east, but we didn't think he'd be bold enough to stop the train." Josephine's mind was racing. "So what happens now? Will he try again?" "We've doubled the watch around town," Sheriff Tanner assured her. "And Matthew here has volunteered to serve as your personal guard until things settle down." Josephine glanced at Matthew, who met her gaze steadily. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "It's no burden, Miss Grayson," Matthew replied. "I was a ranger in Texas before settling here. Keeping people safe is what I do." "Matthew's ranch is just outside town," Judge Wilson added. "He's one of our most respected citizens, and he's been a staunch supporter of bringing education to Fort Bridger. Which is why Lancaster hates me almost as much as he hates the idea of a school," Matthew said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Josephine took a deep breath, considering her options. She could return to Philadelphia, to the safety of her parents' home and her father's perpetual disappointment in her independent spirit. Or she could stay and fight for the opportunity she'd traveled so far to seize. "The school term is set to begin in 2 weeks," she said finally. "I intend to be ready for my students. Mr. Lancaster's intimidation tactics won't change that." Relief washed over the faces of the 3 men. Judge Wilson nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit we hoped for when we selected you from the applicants, Miss Grayson." "Then it's settled," Matthew said. "I'll escort you wherever you need to go, and when I can't be with you, one of the sheriff's deputies will take my place." "What about your ranch?" Josephine asked. "Surely you have responsibilities there." "My foreman can handle things for now," Matthew assured her. "Some things are more important than cattle." The way he looked at her when he said it sent a flutter through Josephine's chest. She told herself it was just gratitude she was feeling, nothing more. After all, they had only just met under the most unusual of circumstances. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you. I won't let you down." After the sheriff and judge departed, Matthew lingered in the parlor with Josephine. Mrs. Holloway had tactfully withdrawn to the kitchen, though Josephine suspected she was listening intently. "I should let you get back to your rest," Matthew said, rising from his chair. "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I can show you the schoolhouse." "I'd like that very much," Josephine replied. "Mr. Irwin, Matthew, please." "Matthew," she amended with a small smile. "I want to thank you properly for what you did today. Those men. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "Best not to think about it," he said gently. "I'm just glad I arrived when I did." Josephine studied him in the lamplight. Without the immediate danger to distract her, she could appreciate the strong lines of his face, the intelligence in his eyes. He wasn't conventionally handsome in the way the young men of Philadelphia society were, but there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength, a certainty of purpose. "How did you know to be at the train?" she asked suddenly. "The sheriff mentioned riders coming to the rescue, but you were already aboard." Matthew's expression grew somber. "We received word from a friendly conductor in Cheyenne that 3 of Lancaster's men had boarded. Given the timing and Lancaster's recent threats against the school, I decided to ride out and meet the train before it reached Fort Bridger." "That was very quick thinking." "In my experience, Miss Grayson—" "Josephine, please," she interrupted with a smile. He returned the smile, and this time it reached his eyes, transforming his face. "In my experience, Josephine, it's better to anticipate trouble than react to it. A philosophy that served me well today." She hesitated, then asked, "Have you been in Fort Bridger long?" 5 years, he replied. "I came west after the war, looking for a fresh start. Found this land that no one seemed to want because it was too rocky for farming, but it made a decent cattle ranch with some work. And before that, you mentioned being a Texas Ranger." A shadow crossed his face. "That was after the war." "Before that? Well, that's a longer story for another time." Josephine sensed there was pain there, perhaps loss. The war between the states had left few families untouched, north or south. "I'll look forward to hearing it someday," she said softly. Matthew nodded, then reached for his hat. "I should go. Dawn comes early and there's much to show you tomorrow. Will you be staying here?" "In town, I mean," Josephine asked. "The sheriff has offered me a cot in his office for now. It's central, and I'll be close if there's any trouble." He moved toward the door, then paused. Josephine, I want you to know that despite today's events, Fort Bridger is a good place with good people. Don't let Lancaster color your impression of your new home. The sincerity in his voice touched her. I won't. In fact, I've already met several people who have given me reason to believe I made the right choice in coming here. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection that neither was ready to acknowledge but both could feel. "Good night, Josephine," Matthew said at last, breaking the spell. "Good night, Matthew. Until tomorrow." After he left, Josephine remained in the parlor, staring into the dying embers in the fireplace. Her life had taken an unexpected turn, fraught with dangers she hadn't anticipated. Yet strangely, she felt more alive than she had in years. Perhaps the frontier would offer more than just professional fulfillment. Perhaps it would offer adventure, challenge, and maybe something else. Something she hadn't even known she was seeking until she looked into Matthew Irwin's eyes. Morning came with golden light streaming through the curtains of Josephine's room. She dressed carefully in a practical blue dress with a white collar, professional, yet suitable for the frontier. Her first day in Fort Bridger proper would be important. First impressions mattered, especially for a schoolteacher who would be responsible for the community's children. As promised, Matthew waited for her downstairs after breakfast. He looked different in the daylight, still vigilant but more at ease. He'd exchanged yesterday's trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and vest. His gun belt remained at his hip, a reminder of the danger that still lurked. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Ready to see your schoolhouse?" "More than ready," Josephine replied, matching his smile. They stepped out into the bright Wyoming morning. Fort Bridger was fully awake now, with merchants opening their shops and wagons rumbling down the main street. Josephine noticed people watching them curiously as they walked. No doubt word of yesterday's incident had spread throughout the small community. "The general store first," Matthew suggested. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you might need some supplies, and Tom Jenkins stocks just about everything." Jenkins' general store was a large wooden building with a wide porch and display windows showing an eclectic array of goods. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with everything from tools to fabric to canned goods. Mr. Irwin, a balding man with spectacles, hurried forward. "And you must be Miss Grayson. Tom Jenkins at your service." He pumped her hand enthusiastically. "We're all mighty glad you made it to town safely." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Anything you need for the school or your lodgings, you just let me know. The town council has an account for school supplies." Josephine spent the next hour selecting primers, slates, chalk, and other necessities for her classroom. Matthew followed patiently, offering suggestions about what the local children might need. "Most of them have never had formal schooling," he explained as she examined a stack of reading primers. "Some can read a bit, taught by their parents, but others will be starting from scratch. And their ages. You'll have everyone from 6 to 16, I expect. Families here need their older children to help with work, but Judge Wilson has been persuasive about the importance of education." Josephine nodded thoughtfully, selecting books for various skill levels. By the time they finished, Mr. Jenkins was arranging to have everything delivered to the schoolhouse. "Now let me show you where you'll be teaching," Matthew said as they stepped back into the sunlight. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple but sturdy one-room building with large windows and a small bell tower. A flagpole stood ready in the yard, though no flag flew yet. "It was finished just last month," Matthew explained, producing a key. "The whole town helped build it." Inside, the schoolhouse smelled of fresh-cut pine. Rows of benches and desks faced a larger desk at the front of the room. A blackboard covered most of the wall behind the teacher's position. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, ready for the coming winter months. Josephine walked slowly down the center aisle, trailing her fingers along the desks. This was her domain, her responsibility. The magnitude of what she had undertaken suddenly felt real in a way it hadn't before. "What do you think?" Matthew asked, watching her carefully. "It's perfect," she said, turning to face him with shining eyes. "Truly perfect. I can't wait to fill it with students." The pride in his expression told her that he had been personally invested in this project. "Most of the lumber came from my land," he confirmed. "The town provided the labor." "You've all gone to such lengths to make this happen. Why? Surely a trading post doesn't need a formal school." Matthew leaned against one of the desks. "Fort Bridger is changing. The railroad has brought new possibilities. We're not just a stop on the trail anymore. We can be a real community, a place where families put down roots." He paused. "That's what Lancaster is afraid of. He wants to keep this land wild, keep people dependent on his operation for work and protection. And you want something different." "I fought in a war, Josephine. I've seen enough conflict to last several lifetimes. What I want now is to build something lasting." He gestured around the schoolhouse. "Education is the foundation of any real community." Josephine was moved by the passion in his voice. This was clearly more than just a building project for him. It was part of a vision. "Then we share the same goal," she said softly. Their eyes met, and that same connection she'd felt the night before sparked between them. Matthew straightened, as if suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "There's more to see in town," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "If you're not too tired." "Not at all," she assured him. They spent the rest of the morning exploring Fort Bridger. Matthew introduced her to the town doctor, the newspaper editor, and several merchants, all of whom welcomed her warmly. By midday, Josephine felt she had a better understanding of the community she'd joined. They were returning to the boarding house for lunch when a rider galloped into town, making straight for the sheriff's office. Matthew tensed immediately. "Wait here," he told Josephine, his hand moving to his gun. Before he could approach the sheriff's office, however, Sheriff Tanner himself emerged, scanning the street until he spotted them. He strode toward them purposefully. "Lancaster's men burned the Thompson homestead last night," he announced without preamble. "Family got out safely, but they've lost everything." Josephine gasped. "That's terrible. Who are the Thompsons?" "New settlers," Matthew explained grimly. "They purchased land that Lancaster has been trying to claim for years. And now they're at the doctor's place with nothing but the clothes on their backs," the sheriff continued. "Mrs. Thompson is expecting their third child soon. We need to help them," Josephine said immediately. "Surely the town can come together, already happening," Sheriff Tanner assured her. "But that's not why I came looking for you. Lancaster sent a message with his men, said the school would be next if the Eastern woman doesn't leave town within 3 days. Matthew's expression darkened. "He's escalating. First an attempt to kidnap Josephine, now arson and direct threats." "I'll post deputies at the schoolhouse," the sheriff said, "and Mrs. Holloway's as well." "No," Matthew shook his head. "Lancaster has spies in town. If he's planning something against the schoolhouse or Josephine, he'll know exactly where your men are stationed." "What do you suggest then?" Sheriff Tanner asked. Matthew turned to Josephine. "I know this isn't proper, but I think you should stay at my ranch until this is resolved. It's defensible. My men are loyal, and Lancaster won't expect it." Josephine's eyes widened. A single woman staying at a bachelor's ranch would be scandalous in Philadelphia, but this wasn't Philadelphia, and her life might be in danger. "Would that not damage my reputation in town?" she asked, concerned about her standing as a teacher. "I'll send word to Judge Wilson," Sheriff Tanner said. He can make it clear this is a security measure approved by the town council, and perhaps Mrs. Holloway would be willing to accompany you as a chaperone." "I wouldn't want to put anyone else at risk," Josephine protested. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Flores, lives at the ranch," Matthew added. "She's a formidable woman who's been with me since I settled here. You'll be properly chaperoned, and Mrs. Holloway can remain safely in town." Josephine considered the proposal. Propriety mattered, especially for a schoolteacher, but so did survival, and something told her she could trust Matthew Irwin completely. "When would we leave?" she asked finally. "As soon as possible," Matthew replied. "We can gather your things and be on the road within the hour. It's better if Lancaster's men don't know exactly when or where you're going." "Then I accept your offer," Josephine said decisively, "though I want to be clear that I have no intention of leaving Fort Bridger permanently. I won't be frightened away from my position." A hint of admiration flickered in Matthew's eyes. "I never thought you would be. You're made of stronger stuff than Lancaster realizes." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "I'll spread word that Miss Grayson is considering returning east after yesterday's ordeal. That should buy us some time while we deal with Lancaster." "And the Thompsons?" Josephine asked. "I'd like to help them before we leave." "I can take you to the doctor's office first," Matthew agreed. "But we should be on the road before sunset." Within the hour, Josephine had visited the displaced family, donating some of her own clothes to Mrs. Thompson and promising that the school would welcome their children as soon as it opened. Then she hurriedly packed her belongings at Mrs. Holloway's, explaining the situation to the concerned landlady. "You be careful out there," Mrs. Holloway warned. "That Matthew Irwin is a good man, but Lancaster is dangerous." "I'll be fine," Josephine assured her, though her heart raced at the thought of what lay ahead. Matthew was waiting with a wagon when she came downstairs. He helped load her trunk, then assisted her onto the seat beside him. Several townspeople watched from a distance, part of the sheriff's ruse to make it appear she might be leaving Fort Bridger. "Ready?" Matthew asked quietly. Josephine nodded, and with a flick of the reins, they were moving, leaving the safety of town behind and heading into the open country where Lancaster's influence was strongest. They traveled in silence for the first few miles, both scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. Matthew had a rifle positioned between them on the seat, ready if needed. The wagon creaked along the rutted trail, gradually climbing into more rugged terrain. "How far is your ranch?" Josephine asked finally. "About 10 miles from town," Matthew replied. "We'll be there before dark if we don't run into trouble." "And if we do," his eyes met hers briefly, "then we deal with it. I've faced worse odds than a few of Lancaster's cowboys." Something in his tone made Josephine wonder again about his past. "You mentioned fighting in the war. Which side?" Matthew was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Union," he said finally. "Cavalry, joined when I was 18, fought until Appomattox." "That's a long time to be at war," Josephine observed softly. "Too long." His hands tightened on the reins. "Lost my brother at Gettysburg. My father couldn't bear it, died 6 months later. By the time I came home to Texas, there wasn't much left to go home to." "I'm so sorry," Josephine said, understanding now some of the shadows she'd seen in his eyes. "Is that why you became a ranger?" He nodded. "Seemed like the thing to do." "Texas was lawless after the war, needed men who could handle themselves. I did that for 3 years before heading further west." "And now you're a rancher." A small smile touched his lips. "Now I'm a rancher. Turns out I prefer building things to enforcing the law, though some habits are hard to break. Like protecting people in need." His eyes met hers again, warmer this time. "Some people are worth protecting, Josephine." The way he said her name sent a flutter through her chest. To hide her reaction, she looked away, focusing on the landscape. The land was becoming more rugged, with rocky outcroppings and stands of pine trees breaking up the rolling prairie. "It's beautiful country," she observed. "It is," Matthew agreed. "Harsh sometimes, but honest. The land doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. Unlike people. Unlike some people," he amended. "Lancaster, for instance. He presents himself as a legitimate businessman, but he's little more than a land pirate." "Have you had trouble with him before?" Matthew's expression darkened. "Plenty. My ranch borders his property to the west. He's been trying to push me out since I arrived, first with offers to buy, then with threats, and eventually more direct actions. Like what happened to the Thompsons, similar. 2 years ago, he had his men stampede a herd through my south pasture, destroying fences and killing some of my cattle. Last year, one of my line cabins was burned. We've had shots fired at my men when they ride near the property line." Josephine felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "And the sheriff hasn't arrested him. Lancaster is careful. He's never directly involved, and his men are loyal or frightened enough to stay quiet, and he has connections in the territorial government. So why does he see the school as such a threat?" Matthew guided the wagon around a sharp bend in the trail before answering. "Because education changes things. People who can read and write, who can understand contracts and laws, they're harder to intimidate and cheat. Lancaster has built his empire on keeping others ignorant and dependent." "And you've been fighting him alone all this time?" "Not alone," Matthew corrected. "The town is behind me, but Lancaster's reach is long and he doesn't fight fair." They fell silent again as the trail narrowed, forcing Matthew to concentrate on navigating the wagon through increasingly difficult terrain. Josephine found herself studying his profile, the determined set of his jaw, the alertness in his posture. He was a man who had seen much hardship, yet retained his principles. It was nearly sunset when they crested a hill, and Josephine caught her first glimpse of Matthew's ranch. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure built of logs and stone. Several outbuildings surrounded it, and in the distance, she could see fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A stream wound through the property, its waters catching the golden light of the setting sun. "Welcome to Silverbrook Ranch," Matthew said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's magnificent," Josephine breathed. "You've built all this in 5 years, with good help and a lot of hard work," he confirmed, guiding the wagon down the hill toward the house. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine, free and clear." As they approached, a man emerged from one of the outbuildings, followed by a large dog that bounded toward the wagon. Matthew raised his hand in greeting. "That's Daniel, my foreman," he explained, "and the overeager welcome committee is Bear." The dog, a massive mix of breeds with a shaggy coat, raced alongside the wagon, barking joyfully. Despite the tension of the day, Josephine couldn't help but smile at the animal's obvious delight at their arrival. Daniel, a weathered man in his 40s with a shock of red hair, waited as they pulled up to the house. "Everything quiet?" Matthew asked as he set the brake. "All's well," Daniel confirmed. "No sign of Lancaster's boys. Mrs. Flores has supper nearly ready." His curious gaze shifted to Josephine. "Daniel, this is Miss Josephine Grayson, the new schoolteacher," Matthew said, jumping down from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us for a while due to some trouble in town." "The attempted kidnapping," Daniel nodded. "Word travels fast. Pleased to meet you, Miss Grayson." "Likewise, Mr." "Just Daniel, madam. No one's called me Mr. in years." Matthew helped Josephine down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they were standing very close, and Josephine caught the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "I'll have your things taken to the guest room," he said, stepping back. "Mrs. Flores will show you where everything is." As if summoned, a plump woman with silver-streaked dark hair appeared at the door of the house. "So this is our teacher," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she descended the porch steps. "I am Alina Flores, Mr. Irwin's housekeeper. Come inside. You must be exhausted after such a journey." Josephine was indeed tired, the strain of the day catching up with her. She allowed Mrs. Flores to usher her into the house while Matthew and Daniel unloaded her trunk. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable. The main room had a large stone fireplace, sturdy furniture covered in colorful woven blankets, and bookshelves lining one wall. It was a man's home, certainly, but not a crude bachelor's quarters as she might have expected. "Mr. Irwin is a reader," Mrs. Flores explained, noticing Josephine's interest in the books. "Many nights he sits by the fire with his books after the day's work is done." "I can see that," Josephine replied, scanning the titles. Many were histories and practical guides to ranching and the law, but there were also novels by Dickens, Cooper, and Scott. "Come, I show you to your room," Mrs. Flores continued. "Then we eat. Mr. Irwin says you had an exciting day, not good exciting, the bad kind. Food will help." The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk beneath the window. A rag rug brightened the plank floor, and clean curtains framed the glass. "Mr. Irwin had this room prepared for his sister who was to visit from Texas," Mrs. Flores explained as she poured water into the washbowl. "But she has not come yet." "I didn't realize Matthew had family nearby," Josephine said, removing her bonnet. "Just the sister now in San Antonio." "They write letters," Mrs. Flores shrugged. "Family is complicated, yes. Now wash up. Supper in 30 minutes. Left alone, Josephine sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past 2 days washing over her. How quickly her life had changed. From the orderly world of Philadelphia to this wild territory where men burned homesteads and attempted kidnappings in broad daylight. And yet, amidst the danger and uncertainty, she had found allies, perhaps even friends. By the time she had freshened up and changed into a clean dress, the smell of cooking had filled the house. She followed it to a dining room where Matthew and Daniel were already seated. Both men rose as she entered. "I hope you're hungry," Matthew said, pulling out a chair for her. "Mrs. Flores believes in feeding people until they can't move." "It is the only proper way," Mrs. Flores declared, bringing in a platter of roasted chicken. "Skinny people cannot work hard." The meal was indeed plentiful: chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the garden Mrs. Flores proudly maintained. The conversation flowed easily as Daniel recounted the ranch's recent activities, and Mrs. Flores shared gossip from town, delivered by the supply wagon driver. Josephine found herself relaxing for the first time since the train incident. There was something comforting about the simple routine of the ranch, the easy camaraderie between Matthew and his employees. She noticed how they deferred to him without servility. He had earned their respect rather than demanded it. After dinner, Daniel excused himself to check on the night guards. "We've doubled the watch," he told Matthew. "No chances with Lancaster on the warpath." "Good," Matthew nodded. "I'll take the midnight shift." "I've already arranged it," Daniel assured him. "You need your rest too, boss." When he had gone, Mrs. Flores began clearing the table. "Miss Grayson, would you like tea in the sitting room? It is too early for bed, I think." "That would be lovely," Josephine agreed. Matthew led her back to the main room where the fireplace had been lit against the evening chill. "Wyoming nights can be cold, even in summer," he explained, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the armchairs flanking the hearth. "It's very different from Philadelphia," Josephine observed. Everything here seems larger somehow, the sky, the land, even the challenges. And the rewards, Matthew added, taking the chair opposite hers. There's freedom here that you can't find in the East, room to build something of your own on your own terms. Is that what drew you here? He nodded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. After the war, after my time as a ranger, I needed space. Texas had too many memories, too many ghosts. And you don't have ghosts here, Josephine asked softly. His eyes met hers, surprisingly vulnerable in the firelight. Fewer, and different kinds. Mrs. Flores arrived with a tray bearing a teapot and cups, interrupting the moment. Here you are. I will be in my room if you need anything. After she left, Matthew poured tea for Josephine. Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch if you'd like. It's safe enough on the property itself. I'd enjoy that, Josephine said, accepting the cup. Though I don't want to distract you from your work. The cattle can survive a day without my direct supervision, he smiled. Daniel is more than capable. They sipped their tea in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Josephine found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the bookshelves. You have an impressive library for a ranch house. Books were my mother's passion, Matthew explained. She taught school in Austin before marrying my father. Some of those volumes were hers, others I've collected over the years. She would be proud of your support for Fort Bridger's school, Josephine said gently. A shadow crossed his face. I'd like to think so. She didn't live to see the war, perhaps that was a blessing. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, and Josephine realized how tired she was. The emotional and physical strain of the past 2 days was catching up to her. Matthew noticed immediately. You should rest, he said, rising. We can talk more tomorrow. Josephine nodded, setting aside her empty cup. Thank you for everything you've done, Matthew. Not just today, but for the school, for the town, for standing up to men like Lancaster. He walked her to the foot of the stairs. Fort Bridger is worth fighting for, he said quietly. And so are you, Josephine. In the soft lamplight, with his blue eyes intent on hers, Josephine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire they'd been sitting beside. For a moment, she thought he might take her hand, or perhaps even, but no, he simply nodded and stepped back. Sleep well. You're safe here. Good night, Matthew, she murmured. Turning to ascend the stairs, in her room, Josephine prepared for bed, her mind full of the day's events and of Matthew Irwin. There was something about him that drew her, beyond his obvious courage and principles. A depth of character, a quiet strength that she found herself increasingly drawn to. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that despite the danger that had brought her to Silverbrook Ranch, she felt a curious sense of rightness, as if some part of her had been waiting to arrive at this place, to meet this man without even knowing it. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the ranch. In the bunkhouse, men checked their weapons before turning in. In the pastures, cattle lowed softly under a star-filled sky. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of Silverbrook, Edward Lancaster plotted his next move against the schoolteacher, who represented everything he opposed. But for now, in the guest room of Matthew's home, Josephine Grayson slept peacefully, feeling safer than she had any right to under the circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, she was where she needed to be. Dawn broke clear and bright over Silverbrook Ranch. Josephine woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a working cattle operation, men calling to one another, the lowing of cattle, the clang of metal from what must be the blacksmith's forge. For a moment, she was disoriented, but then memory returned. She was at Matthew's ranch, seeking shelter from Lancaster's threats. She dressed quickly in a practical blue skirt and white shirtwaist, braiding her dark hair and pinning it up neatly. A teacher must maintain standards, even when in hiding, she thought wryly. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Flores in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "Good morning, Miss Grayson," the housekeeper greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Josephine replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Flores poured for her. "Is Mr. Irwin about?" "He has been up since before dawn," Mrs. Flores said with a hint of disapproval. "That man works too hard. He is checking the north pasture with Daniel. Said to tell you he will return mid-morning to show you the ranch." "Oh, I wouldn't want to take him away from his duties," Josephine protested. Mrs. Flores snorted. "The ranch will not fall apart if he takes one day to entertain a guest, especially a pretty guest." Josephine felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "Mrs. Flores, I assure you, Mr. Irwin is simply being kind because of the situation in town." The older woman gave her a knowing look. "If you say so, miss. Now sit. Breakfast is nearly ready." After a hearty meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Josephine offered to help with household chores, but Mrs. Flores shooed her outside. "Go enjoy the morning. It is a beautiful day." Taking her advice, Josephine explored the immediate surroundings of the ranch house. The main yard was neat and functional, with outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle around the house. Beyond them stretched fenced pastures and, in the distance, rolling hills that gave way to mountains on the horizon. Bear, the ranch dog, appointed himself her guide, trotting alongside her as she wandered. She found her way to a small garden where Mrs. Flores grew vegetables and herbs, then to a paddock where several horses gazed at her curiously over the fence. "That's Midnight," a voice said behind her, making her start. "The black one with the star on his forehead. He's mine." Josephine turned to find Matthew watching her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked different here on his own land, more relaxed, more himself somehow. "He's beautiful," she said, turning back to admire the sleek black horse that had approached the fence. "And he knows it," Matthew replied, coming to stand beside her. "Most vain animal I've ever owned." Midnight tossed his head as if in protest, making Josephine laugh. "I think you've offended him." "He'll survive," Matthew said dryly, but he reached out to stroke the horse's nose affectionately. "How are you this morning? Did you sleep well?" "Very well," Josephine assured him. "Your home is lovely, Matthew. I can see why you're proud of it." His eyes met hers, pleased by her approval. "It's been a labor of love. When I first saw this land, most people thought I was crazy to try ranching here. Too rocky, too far from the main cattle trails. But I saw potential." "You've certainly proven them wrong," Josephine observed, gesturing to the thriving operation around them. "Not without help," Matthew acknowledged. "Daniel was with me from the start. Mrs. Flores came the second year when it became clear that neither of us could cook anything worth eating, and I've been fortunate to find good men who are loyal to the ranch." "And to you," Josephine added. She had seen the respect in the eyes of the ranch hands they passed. Matthew looked slightly uncomfortable with the personal observation. "Would you like to see more of the ranch? I could saddle a horse for you if you ride." "I do, though not as well as I should," Josephine admitted. "My father thought horseback riding was an appropriate accomplishment for a young lady, but only in the most controlled circumstances." "Well, we can start with something gentle," Matthew assured her. "Daisy is a mare who's carried children and grandmothers without complaint." Soon they were mounted and riding away from the main buildings, Bear loping alongside them. Josephine felt a sense of freedom she had rarely experienced, moving across the open landscape with the wind in her face and the steady rhythm of her mount beneath her. Matthew was an attentive guide, pointing out landmarks and explaining the operation of the ranch. She learned that Silverbrook ran nearly 800 head of cattle, that they primarily supplied beef to the railroad workers and growing settlements. and that Matthew was experimenting with different breeds to develop cattle that could thrive in Wyoming's challenging climate. "You're not just a rancher," Josephine observed as they paused atop a ridge overlooking a lush valley where a herd grazed. "You're a scientist and businessman as well." Matthew looked pleased by her understanding. "Ranching is changing. It's not enough anymore to simply run cattle on open range and round them up once a year. The days of the long drives to distant railheads are ending. We need to be smarter, more efficient. And that's another reason Lancaster sees you as a threat," Josephine concluded. "You represent the future, while he clings to the past. A past that was profitable for men like him," Matthew nodded. "The chaos after the war allowed many to seize land and power with little oversight. Now that proper law and governance are catching up, their methods don't work so well." They rode in companionable silence for a while, following a stream that wound through Matthew's property. The water sparkled in the sunlight, clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. "This is the Silver Brook," Matthew explained as they rode alongside it. "It's what gave the ranch its name." "It's beautiful," Josephine said. "Everything here is beautiful in its own way. Even the rugged parts have a certain honesty to them." Matthew glanced at her with renewed interest. "Most Eastern visitors see only the harshness of this country, not its beauty." "Perhaps they're not looking properly," Josephine suggested. "Or perhaps they come with too many preconceptions about what beauty should be." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a gunshot. Matthew reacted instantly, standing in his stirrups to peer in the direction of the sound. "That came from near the north boundary," he said tensely. "We should head back." He turned his horse, but before they could move, a rider appeared on the ridge above them, waving urgently. Even at a distance, Josephine recognized Daniel's distinctive red hair. "Matt," he called, guiding his horse down the steep slope toward them. "Trouble at the line cabin." "Lancaster's men, they've got Jake." Matthew's expression hardened. "What happened?" Daniel pulled up beside them, his horse blowing hard from the fast ride. "Jake rode out to check the north fence line this morning. When he didn't report back, I sent 2 men looking. They found signs of a struggle near the boundary, then tracked him to Lancaster's line cabin. He's being held inside. They beat him pretty badly." "How many of Lancaster's men?" Matthew demanded. "At least 6 that we could see," Daniel replied grimly. "They're waiting for Lancaster himself. One of our boys overheard them saying the boss wanted to talk to Jake personally about trespassing." "Jake wasn't trespassing," Matthew said, his voice tight with anger. "That fence line has been established for years. Lancaster's claiming we moved the markers," Daniel said. "It's just an excuse, of course." Matthew turned to Josephine, his expression torn between concern for her and his injured ranch hand. "I need to deal with this. Daniel can escort you back to the house." "No," Josephine interrupted. "I'm coming with you." Both men stared at her in surprise. "Absolutely not," Matthew said firmly. "It's too dangerous." "If Lancaster is coming, I want to meet him," Josephine insisted. "He's threatening my life and my livelihood. I refuse to hide while others face danger on my behalf." "Miss Grayson," Daniel began awkwardly. "These aren't gentlemen we're dealing with." "I'm well aware of that," Josephine replied, her chin lifted determinedly. "But I'm also aware that Mr. Lancaster might be less likely to resort to violence with a female witness present, particularly one with connections to the territorial government through Judge Wilson." Matthew studied her for a long moment, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "You're either very brave or very foolhardy, Josephine Grayson." "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted, "but I'm also practical. This situation involves me directly. I should be part of resolving it." Matthew exchanged a glance with Daniel, who shrugged slightly as if to say the decision was his employer's. Finally, Matthew nodded. "You stay with me at all times," he said firmly. "And if I tell you to leave, you go immediately with whoever I designate to escort you. No arguments." "Agreed," Josephine said, relief washing through her. She had half expected him to refuse outright. "Daniel, ride back and gather 6 men armed," Matthew instructed. "Have them approach from the east quietly. We'll come in from the south." "You got it, boss," Daniel said, wheeling his horse around. "And Daniel," Matthew called after him, "tell them no shooting unless absolutely necessary. I want Jake out safely, not a bloodbath." As Daniel galloped away, Matthew turned to Josephine. "We need to move fast but carefully. Can you manage?" Josephine nodded, gathering her reins. "Lead the way." They rode north at a swift pace, following a trail that wound through stands of pine trees. Matthew was silent, his expression grim with concentration. Josephine could sense the tension in him, not fear, but a focused readiness that reminded her that this man had been both a soldier and a lawman before becoming a rancher. After about 20 minutes of hard riding, Matthew slowed, guiding them into a denser patch of forest. "The line cabin is just over that rise," he explained quietly. "Lancaster's men will have lookouts." He dismounted and helped Josephine down from her horse. Tethering both animals to a tree, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a pair of field glasses. "Wait here," he instructed, moving carefully through the trees toward the edge of the forest. Josephine followed, ignoring his frown of disapproval. "I said I'd stay with you," she reminded him in a whisper. For a moment, she thought he might insist she return to the horses, but then he simply nodded and continued forward, more carefully now to ensure she could follow safely. At the edge of the tree line, Matthew dropped to one knee, using the cover of a fallen log to survey the scene below. Josephine knelt beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as she tried to see what he was examining. The cabin was a simple structure, a single room with a stone chimney, built to shelter line riders during bad weather or when working the distant parts of the ranch. Outside, several men lounged on the porch or stood near their horses. Even from this distance, Josephine could see the rifles they carried. Matthew handed her the field glasses. "Take a look, but stay low." Through the glasses, the scene came into sharp focus. Josephine could make out 6 men, all armed, all with the hard look of experienced fighters rather than simple cowhands. One man paced the porch, clearly impatient. "I don't see your ranch hand," she whispered. "He'll be inside," Matthew replied grimly. Lancaster's men aren't known for their gentle treatment of prisoners. A movement on the trail leading to the cabin caught their attention. A cloud of dust heralded the approach of riders, at least 3, moving at a steady pace. "Lancaster," Matthew murmured, taking back the field glasses to confirm his suspicion. "And 2 of his gunmen." "What's your plan?" Josephine asked, surprised at how steady her voice remained despite her racing heart. "Daniel and our men should be in position to the east by now," Matthew said, scanning the tree line on the far side of the clearing. "We need to get closer before Lancaster arrives. There's a wash that runs behind the cabin. It might give us cover." He looked at her seriously. "This is your last chance to stay behind, Josephine. Once we're down there, things could get ugly fast." Josephine met his gaze unflinchingly. "I understand the risk. I'm coming with you." Something flickered in his eyes, concern, certainly, but also a deepening respect. "Stay close and do exactly as I say." They retreated into the forest, circling around to approach the cabin from behind. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, adding urgency to their movements. Matthew led her down into a dry stream bed that offered some cover. though Josephine's skirts made moving quietly a challenge. They had just reached a point directly behind the cabin when they heard the new arrivals. A man's voice, deep and commanding, carried clearly in the still air. "Where is the trespasser?" the voice demanded. "I want to talk to this Silverbrook rider who thinks he can move my boundary markers." "Inside, Mr. Lancaster," one of the men replied. "We've been waiting for you before proceeding further." "Bring him out," Lancaster ordered. "I want everyone to witness what happens to those who encroach on my land." Matthew tensed beside Josephine. "Stay here," he whispered. "I need to get a clear look at what's happening." Before she could protest, he had moved swiftly up the bank of the wash, finding cover behind a large rock near the rear of the cabin. From her position, Josephine could still see him, but she was hidden from anyone who might glance in their direction. She heard the cabin door open, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. A pained groan reached her ears. "This the one?" Lancaster's voice again, closer now. "Yes, sir," another man confirmed. "Caught him red-handed moving the stones on the boundary line." "That's a lie." A new voice, weaker but defiant. "I was checking our fence on our land. You jumped me from behind," the sound of a blow, then another groan. "Your boss has been pushing his luck for years," Lancaster said coldly, "thinking his Army record and Texas star make him untouchable. Well, he's about to learn differently. First his fences, then his cattle, then his precious schoolteacher. By the time I'm done, there won't be a Silverbrook ranch anymore." Josephine's blood ran cold at the casual way her life was included in Lancaster's threats. This wasn't just about land, it was personal hatred directed at Matthew, and everything he stood for. She could see Matthew's hand move to his gun, his body tense with the effort of restraint. He was waiting for something, probably a signal from Daniel that his men were in position. A piercing whistle broke the tension, 3 notes in quick succession. Matthew glanced toward the eastern tree line, then back at Josephine. He motioned for her to stay down, then called out in a voice that carried across the clearing. "Let him go, Lancaster. You're surrounded." Chaos erupted. Men shouted, boots pounded on wooden planks, and the metallic sound of weapons being readied filled the air. Josephine risked raising her head just enough to see over the bank of the wash. Edward Lancaster stood on the porch of the cabin, a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and the bearing of someone used to command. His men had fanned out, taking cover behind horses and the corners of the cabin. On the ground before the porch lay a man Josephine assumed was Jake, his face bloodied, his hands bound. "Irwin," Lancaster called. "Come out where I can see you or your man gets a bullet." Matthew stood, his gun drawn but pointed skyward. "I'm here, Lancaster, and I'm not alone." As if on cue, Daniel and 5 armed ranch hands emerged from the tree line to the east, rifles ready. 2 more of Matthew's men appeared from the south, having circled around during the distraction. "You're outnumbered," Matthew continued, moving forward slowly. "Release my man, and we can discuss this boundary dispute like civilized people." Lancaster laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Civilized? You're the one who brought an army to my line cabin." "Your cabin," Matthew countered. "This structure has been on Silverbrook land since I purchased it. The boundary line is clearly marked and legally registered in Fort Bridger." "Documents can be altered," Lancaster said dismissively, "and stones can be moved, like the ones your men shifted last night to create this false trespass." Matthew was closer now, close enough for Josephine to see the controlled anger in his stance. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't have witnesses to the original boundary?" Something in his tone made Lancaster hesitate. "What witnesses?" "The survey team from the Territorial Land Office that mapped the boundary 3 years ago," Matthew replied. "Their official records are in Cheyenne, beyond even your reach." Josephine saw uncertainty cross Lancaster's face for the first time. He hadn't expected Matthew to have official documentation. Taking advantage of the moment, Matthew pressed forward. "This ends now, Lancaster. Your cattle-baron days are numbered. Fort Bridger has a school, a newspaper, a proper court. People aren't afraid of you anymore." "People should be afraid," Lancaster snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Matthew warned, his own weapon now leveled at Lancaster's chest. "Drop it, slowly." For a tense moment, Josephine thought Lancaster would draw despite the odds. Then, with a curse, he lowered his hand. "This isn't over, Irwin," he said through clenched teeth. "Yes, it is," a new voice called from the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Tanner rode into view, accompanied by 4 deputies. "Edward Lancaster, you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder." Lancaster's face contorted with rage. "On whose authority?" "Territorial governors," the sheriff replied, producing an official-looking document. "Seems your friends in Cheyenne aren't as loyal as you thought. Judge Wilson sent a full report of your activities, including the attempted kidnapping of Miss Grayson and the burning of the Thompson homestead." As the sheriff's men moved to secure Lancaster and his men, Matthew hurried to where Jake lay on the ground. He cut the ropes binding the injured ranch hand's wrists and helped him to a sitting position. "Can you ride?" Matthew asked, examining the man's injuries. "If it means getting away from here, I can manage," Jake replied, attempting a grin despite his split lip. Josephine emerged from her hiding place, picking her way carefully down to where Matthew knelt beside his injured man. Lancaster, being handcuffed by one of the deputies, spotted her, and his eyes narrowed with recognition. "The schoolteacher," he spat. "I should have known you'd be mixed up in this, Irwin. Always championing lost causes and interfering women." Matthew stood, positioning himself between Lancaster and Josephine. "Miss Grayson isn't interfering, Lancaster. She's building something, a future for this community that doesn't include bullies like you." The sheriff nodded to his deputies to take Lancaster away. "We'll hold him for trial in Cheyenne. The territorial court has been looking for an excuse to rein him in for years." As Lancaster was led to a waiting horse, he turned back to face Matthew and Josephine. "This territory has a long memory, Irwin, and so do I. Your schoolmarm won't last a year out here." "That's where you're wrong," Josephine said, finding her voice at last. She stepped forward, ignoring Matthew's protective gesture. "I intend to stay in Fort Bridger for many years, Mr. Lancaster. Long enough to ensure that children grow up knowing the difference between strength and cruelty, between building and destroying. Your kind of power is already becoming a relic of the past." Lancaster glared at her, but the sheriff pushed him toward his mount. "Save it for the judge, Lancaster. I reckon he'll be real interested in your views on territorial development." As Lancaster and his men were led away, Daniel approached Matthew. "Boss, we should get Jake back to the ranch. He needs the doctor." "I've already sent for him," Sheriff Tanner said. "He'll meet you at Silverbrook." Matthew nodded, then turned to Josephine, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though in truth, the reality of the danger was only now fully sinking in. "Is it really over? Will Lancaster be convicted?" "The territorial court won't be as easily influenced as local officials," Matthew said. "And with multiple witnesses to today's events, plus the attempted kidnapping. Yes, I believe his days of terrorizing this region are ending." Relief washed over Josephine, followed quickly by a wave of exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving her suddenly weak. Matthew noticed immediately. "Let's get you back to the ranch," he said gently, his hand steady on her elbow. "It's been a long day." "The longest," she agreed with a wan smile. The ride back to Silverbrook was slower than their earlier journey, with Jake's injuries necessitating a careful pace. Josephine found herself riding beside Matthew, their horses walking steadily side by side. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, giving everything a golden glow that seemed at odds with the violence they had just witnessed. "I've been thinking about what you said to Lancaster," Matthew said, after they had ridden in silence for some time. "About staying in Fort Bridger for many years." Josephine glanced at him, unable to read his expression. "I meant it, assuming the town council still wants me after all this trouble." "The town council wants you more than ever," Matthew assured her. "Judge Wilson sent word this morning they're planning a special reception to welcome you properly once Lancaster is safely behind bars." "That's very kind of them," Josephine said, touched by the community support. "It's more than kindness," Matthew replied. "It's recognition of what you represent, hope for the future, for a real community where children can grow up with more options than becoming ranch hands or saloon girls." Something in his tone made Josephine study him more carefully. "You sound very personally invested in this vision." Matthew was silent for several strides, as if considering how much to share. "My mother believed education was the key to a better life," he said finally. "She taught my brother and me to read before we were 5, made sure we understood mathematics and history, even when my father thought such knowledge unnecessary for boys destined to work cattle." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Josephine said softly. "She was," Matthew agreed. "When I first came to this valley, I remembered her dream of starting a proper school in our Texas town, a dream she never realized. Building the schoolhouse in Fort Bridger felt like honoring her memory." Josephine felt a deeper understanding of Matthew's determination to protect the school and her from Lancaster's threats. It wasn't just about community progress, it was personal. "Your mother would be proud," she said, reaching impulsively to touch his arm. "Not just of the school, but of the man you've become." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The connection that had been growing since their first meeting on the train deepened into something neither was ready to name but both could feel. Matthew cleared his throat, looking ahead to where the ranch buildings were just coming into view. "We should focus on getting Jake seen by the doctor," he said, though his voice had softened. "And you need rest after today's excitement." "Yes," Josephine agreed, withdrawing her hand self-consciously. "Of course." But as they rode the remaining distance to Silverbrook Ranch, side by side in the golden afternoon light, Josephine knew that something had changed irrevocably. This wild territory that had seemed so foreign to her just days ago was beginning to feel like a place she might belong. And the man riding beside her, this complex mixture of soldier, lawman, and rancher, was becoming someone she couldn't imagine her future without. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. With Lancaster awaiting trial in Cheyenne, Fort Bridger breathed a collective sigh of relief. Josephine moved back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house in town, though she found herself missing the comfortable routines of Silverbrook Ranch more than she had expected. The schoolhouse was prepared for the beginning of term, with Josephine spending long hours organizing books, preparing lessons, and meeting with parents and prospective students. The town had rallied around her, bringing supplies, offering assistance, and generally making her feel welcome in her new home. Matthew rode into town regularly, ostensibly to check on the schoolhouse preparations or to meet with the town council, but his visits invariably included time spent with Josephine. They would walk together through the growing settlement, discussing books, sharing stories of their pasts, and mapping out hopes for Fort Bridger's future. On the Sunday before school was to begin, Judge Wilson hosted a reception for Josephine at his home, a formal welcome delayed by the Lancaster situation. The entire town seemed to attend, from ranch hands to merchants to the families whose children would soon be filling the schoolhouse. Josephine wore her best dress for the occasion, a deep green silk that complemented her dark hair and brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Mrs. Holloway had helped her arrange her hair in an elegant style, and as Josephine surveyed her reflection in the small mirror of her room, she was pleased with the result. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Holloway said approvingly. "That Mr. Irwin won't know what hit him." "Mrs. Holloway," Josephine protested, feeling her cheeks warm. "Matthew and I are merely colleagues with a shared interest in education." The landlady's knowing smile was her only response as she bustled out of the room to finish her own preparations. The reception was held in Judge Wilson's garden, which had been decorated with paper lanterns for the occasion. Tables laden with food and drink were arranged beneath the trees, and someone had brought a fiddle and harmonica to provide music. Josephine was greeted warmly as she arrived, introduced to those townspeople she had not yet met, and generally made to feel the guest of honor. She was in conversation with the newspaper editor when she felt a presence at her shoulder. "Miss Grayson," Matthew's deep voice sent a flutter through her chest. "You look beautiful this evening." She turned to find him standing beside her, more formally dressed than she had ever seen him, in a dark suit and crisp white shirt. His hair was neatly combed and he had trimmed his beard. The overall effect was striking, the rugged rancher transformed into a gentleman, yet with the same quiet strength in his bearing. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin," she replied formally, aware of the curious eyes watching them. "You look quite handsome yourself." The editor excused himself with a poorly concealed smile, leaving them alone despite the crowd around them. "Walk with me," Matthew suggested, offering his arm. Josephine placed her hand on his sleeve, allowing him to guide her toward a quieter corner of the garden where rose bushes provided some privacy from the general gathering. "How are the preparations for tomorrow?" he asked. "Complete, I think," Josephine replied, "though I must admit to some nervousness. 28 students of varying ages and abilities will be quite the challenge." "You'll manage brilliantly," Matthew said with such conviction that she couldn't help but believe him. "The children are excited, even the older boys who pretend indifference. Education hasn't been available here before, not properly. I hope I can live up to everyone's expectations," Josephine said, revealing a vulnerability she rarely acknowledged. Matthew's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "You already have, Josephine. You faced Lancaster's threats with courage that impressed even the most skeptical old-timers in town." She smiled at that. "I was terrified, if you must know. But my father always said that courage isn't about not feeling fear, it's about acting despite it." "A wise man, your father," Matthew observed. "In many ways, yes," Josephine agreed. "Though he still doesn't understand why I chose to come west rather than marry the banker's son he had selected for me." Matthew's eyebrows rose. "There was a banker's son. You never mentioned him before." "Because he hardly seems worth mentioning," Josephine replied with a small laugh. "Harold Whitley is perfectly pleasant, perfectly prosperous, and perfectly dull. My father saw only his financial stability and social position." "And what did you see?" Matthew asked, his eyes intent on hers. "A life mapped out with no surprises, no challenges, no purpose beyond social calls and charity committees," Josephine said honestly. "I wanted more, to make a real difference, to build something meaningful." "Like a school in a frontier town," Matthew said with understanding. "Exactly. Though I didn't anticipate quite so much excitement in the process." They had reached a small bench nestled among the roses. Matthew gestured for her to sit, then took his place beside her. From this vantage point, they could see the gathering without being easily observed themselves. "Josephine," Matthew began, his voice lower and more serious, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." The intensity in his tone made her heart quicken. "Yes. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your determination and courage, it's made me realize something." He turned slightly to face her more directly. "I've been alone at Silverbrook for 5 years. After the war, after my time as a ranger, I thought that was what I wanted: peace, solitude, just me and the land and the work. And now," Josephine prompted when he paused, "now I find myself thinking about the future differently." His eyes, so blue in the lantern light, held her steadily. "I find myself thinking about a partner to share that future with." Josephine's breath caught. "Matthew, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "We've known each other barely 3 weeks, but I feel a connection to you that I've never felt with anyone before, and I wanted you to know that before the school term begins and your days are filled with teaching." "I feel it too," Josephine admitted softly. "This connection. It's unexpected but undeniable." Relief and joy lit Matthew's face. "Then may I call on you properly, when your duties permit?" "I would like that very much," Josephine replied, happiness bubbling through her like champagne. Matthew's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a rightness that neither could deny. For a long moment, they sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the reception continuing in the background. "There will be talk," Josephine said finally, practicality reasserting itself. "A schoolteacher is expected to maintain certain standards of propriety." "I'll speak with Judge Wilson," Matthew assured her. "As head of the town council and the school board, his approval will matter most." "But Josephine, no one who has seen you stand up to Lancaster would dare question your character." She smiled at that. "Still, we should proceed with appropriate decorum. The children will be watching their teacher's every move." "Appropriate decorum it is," Matthew agreed solemnly, though his eyes twinkled with suppressed amusement. "Though I reserve the right to dream of less decorous moments in our future." The warmth in his gaze sent a pleasant shiver through Josephine. "Mr. Irwin, you forget yourself," she teased. "Frequently around you," he admitted. "We should rejoin the reception before your reputation is irreparably damaged by 5 minutes alone in my company." He stood and offered his hand to help her rise. As she took it, he held her gaze for a moment longer. "Thank you, Josephine, for bringing new life to Fort Bridger and to me." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you for being there when I stepped off that train," she replied softly. "I can't imagine what might have happened otherwise." "I prefer not to think about that," Matthew said, his expression momentarily darkening. "Let's focus instead on the future we're building here together." With her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, Matthew escorted Josephine back to the reception. She was aware of curious glances and knowing smiles as they rejoined the gathering, but she found she didn't mind. Fort Bridger was becoming her home, these people her community, and Matthew Irwin. Well, he was becoming something much more significant than a colleague or friend. The first day of school dawned bright and clear. Josephine arrived at the schoolhouse 2 hours early, too nervous to remain in her room at Mrs. Holloway's. She arranged and rearranged books, checked that there was sufficient chalk for the day's lessons, and swept the already clean floor. At precisely 8 o'clock, she rang the bell that hung in the small tower atop the schoolhouse. Its clear tone carried across Fort Bridger, announcing the official commencement of the town's first proper school term. Children began arriving almost immediately, some alone, others accompanied by parents eager to see their offspring settled in this new venture. Josephine greeted each child by name, having memorized the list provided by Judge Wilson. The youngest was indeed 6, a solemn-faced girl named Emma with braids nearly as long as she was tall. The oldest was William, a 15-year-old who worked at the livery stable and came only at his employer's insistence. By 8:30, all 28 students were seated. Josephine stood before them, surveying the varied faces, some excited, some apprehensive, a few openly skeptical. This was what she had come west for, these children and the difference she might make in their lives. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Miss Grayson, and I am honored to be your teacher. Here in this room, we will explore the world through books and numbers, history and science. But first, I'd like each of you to tell me your name and one thing you hope to learn this year." As the children took turns introducing themselves, Josephine noticed a figure standing in the open doorway. Matthew watched the proceedings with a smile, his hat in his hands. When their eyes met, he nodded respectfully but didn't interrupt the class. Once the introductions were complete, Josephine moved on to her first lesson, a basic assessment of reading abilities so she could group the children appropriately. As they bent over their slates, she made her way to the door. "Mr. Irwin," she greeted him quietly, "have you come to enroll?" His smile deepened at her teasing. "I fear I'm too old for your classroom, Miss Grayson. I merely wanted to witness this historic moment for Fort Bridger." "And what is your assessment so far?" she asked. "That our town is very fortunate in its teacher," he replied, his eyes warm with admiration. "And that those children don't yet realize how lucky they are." "It's I who am lucky," Josephine said sincerely, glancing back at her students. "To have this opportunity, this fresh start." "I won't keep you from your duties," Matthew said. "But I wondered if you might permit me to escort you to dinner at the hotel this Saturday evening, to celebrate your first week of teaching." "I would enjoy that very much," Josephine replied, aware of curious eyes watching from the classroom. "Until Saturday, then." Matthew replaced his hat, nodded politely, and departed, leaving Josephine with a smile she couldn't quite suppress as she returned to her pupils. The first week of school passed in a whirlwind of activity. Josephine discovered that her students varied widely in their previous exposure to education. Some could read fluently, while others barely recognized letters. A few showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics, while others struggled with basic sums. She found herself dividing the classroom into groups based on ability rather than age, creating a system where more advanced students helped those who needed extra attention. By Friday, she had established a routine that seemed to work, though she collapsed into bed each night exhausted from the mental and physical demands of teaching such a diverse group. Saturday evening came as a welcome respite. Josephine dressed with special care in a blue silk dress she had packed, but not yet worn in Fort Bridger. It was perhaps more formal than the town's usual standards, but the hotel dining room was the closest thing to fine dining available, and she wanted to honor Matthew's invitation appropriately. He called for her at the boarding house promptly at 6, looking handsome in the same dark suit he had worn to the reception. Mrs. Holloway made a great show of reminding them that proper young ladies were expected home by 10, though her wink at Matthew undermined the severity of her admonition. The Fort Bridger Hotel was the tallest building in town, a 3-story structure with pretensions of grandeur that didn't quite match its frontier reality. Still, the dining room was pleasantly appointed with white tablecloths and proper silverware, and the hotel owner had clearly instructed the staff to provide special attention to Matthew and Josephine. They were seated at the best table, near the window but away from the busier central area. A small vase of wildflowers had been placed as a centerpiece, an unexpected touch that made Josephine smile. "The hotel seems to be making an extra effort this evening," she observed as they were seated. "Mrs. Holloway might have mentioned our dinner plans to the owner's wife," Matthew admitted with a grin. "News travels fast in small towns." "So I'm learning," Josephine replied. "My students have already informed me that you've been building a new fence on the north pasture, that your foreman won $20 in a poker game last weekend, and that your dog Bear once chased the mayor's cat up a tree where it remained for 2 days." Matthew laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "All true, I'm afraid, though I'd add that the mayor's cat was a notorious hunter of songbirds and fully deserved Bear's attention." Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on the week's school activities, developments at the ranch, and the latest news from Cheyenne, where Lancaster's trial was set to begin the following month. "Judge Wilson received word that Lancaster's lawyers are seeking a delay," Matthew told her as they shared a piece of apple pie for dessert. "They claim he needs more time to gather witnesses to dispute the charges." "Is that likely to be granted?" Josephine asked, concern creasing her brow. "Not according to the judge. The territorial court has been watching Lancaster for years, waiting for enough evidence to move against him. They won't risk losing momentum now." "Good," Josephine said firmly. "Though I must admit, with him in custody, it's been easy to forget the danger he represented." "Don't forget it entirely," Matthew cautioned. "Lancaster has friends and employees still in the area. The sheriff is keeping a close eye on things, but it pays to remain vigilant." Josephine nodded, sobered by the reminder. "Have there been any incidents?" "Nothing serious," Matthew assured her. "Some of his men have been drowning their sorrows at the saloon, talking big about what they'll do when the boss returns. But without Lancaster's money and direction, they're mostly just noise." As they finished their meal, Matthew suggested a walk before returning to the boarding house. The evening was mild, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They strolled along Fort Bridger's Main Street, passing the darkened storefronts of businesses closed for the night. "I've been thinking," Matthew said as they walked, "about the school and what else it might need." "Books are my greatest concern," Josephine replied. "We have basic primers and readers, but little in the way of literature or history texts." "I have quite a few books at Silverbrook that might be suitable," Matthew offered. "And I've written to my sister in San Antonio. She teaches at a girls' school there and has connections with publishers." "That would be wonderful," Josephine said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "The older students especially need more challenging material. William has already finished all the readers we have available." "The livery boy?" Matthew asked. "I wouldn't have guessed he had such an appetite for reading." "He hides it well," Josephine smiled. "But I found him poring over a discarded newspaper during lunch yesterday, sounding out the more difficult words. When I offered to help, he pretended he wasn't interested, but he stayed after school for an hour working through an article about the Transcontinental Railroad." "You've made quite an impression in just 1 week," Matthew observed, his voice warm with admiration. "It's early days yet," Josephine demurred. "The real test will come when the novelty wears off and the harder work begins." They had reached the end of the main street and turned toward the boarding house. The town was quiet, most residents already retired for the evening. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound haunting in the still night. "Josephine," Matthew said, stopping beneath a large cottonwood tree, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The seriousness in his tone made her heart skip. "Yes." He took both her hands in his expression earnest in the moonlight filtering through the branches above them. "I know we agreed to proceed with propriety, and I intend to honor that. But I find myself thinking about you constantly when I'm working at the ranch, when I'm in town on business, even when I'm falling asleep at night." Josephine's breath caught at his candor. "Matthew, please, let me finish," he requested gently. "I've never been a man who rushes into things. The war taught me the value of patience, of careful consideration. But sometimes, rarely, life presents an opportunity that must be recognized and seized before it passes." He drew a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I believe what's growing between us is special, perhaps even once in a lifetime. I don't want to waste time with unnecessary hesitation when my heart is already certain." "What are you asking exactly?" Josephine whispered, though she thought she knew. "May I court you with the intention of marriage, Josephine Grayson?" Matthew asked directly. "Not immediately. I understand you need time to establish yourself as a teacher, to be sure of your own feelings. But with that as our understood destination." Joy bubbled up inside Josephine, bright and effervescent. In just 3 weeks, this man had come to mean more to her than anyone outside her family ever had. The idea of building a future with him felt right in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much, Matthew." His smile was brilliant even in the dim light. "May I kiss you, then, to seal our understanding?" In answer, Josephine stepped closer, tilting her face up to his. Matthew's hands gently framed her face as he lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. It was brief, mindful of their public location, but it left Josephine breathless nonetheless. "I should get you back to Mrs. Holloway's before she sends a search party," Matthew said reluctantly, offering his arm once more. As they walked the remaining distance to the boarding house, Josephine felt as though she were floating. The Wyoming territory, which had seemed so alien and forbidding just weeks ago, now felt like exactly where she was meant to be. On the porch of the boarding house, Matthew kissed her once more, chastely on the cheek this time. "Good night, Josephine. Sleep well." "Good night, Matthew," she replied, reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for dinner and for everything." His smile was understanding. "I'll see you at church tomorrow." "Yes, I'll be there," she assured him. With a final tip of his hat, Matthew turned and walked back toward the hotel where he kept a room when staying in town overnight. Josephine watched him go, her heart full to bursting with new possibilities. Mrs. Holloway was waiting in the parlor, pretending to read but obviously alert for Josephine's return. "Did you have a nice evening, dear?" she asked innocently. "Lovely," Josephine replied, knowing her glowing face probably revealed far more than her words. "Mr. Irwin is a fine man, Mrs. Holloway observed. "The whole town thinks so." "Yes, he is," Josephine agreed, not bothering to hide her smile. The older woman nodded approvingly. "Well, I won't pry, but if there's news you'd like to share sometime soon, I'd be delighted to hear it." "When there's news, Mrs. Holloway, you'll be among the first to know," Josephine promised, then headed upstairs to her room, her steps light with happiness. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to Josephine's new life in Fort Bridger. Weekdays were devoted to her students, with each day bringing small victories and occasional setbacks in her efforts to educate the town's children. Evenings were spent preparing lessons and grading the work her pupils produced. Saturdays often included dinner with Matthew, sometimes at the hotel, sometimes in the small restaurant operated by a French trapper's widow. And occasionally, when weather permitted, picnic lunches on the banks of the stream that ran near town. Their courtship progressed with a proper decorum that satisfied the town's standards of propriety, while allowing their feelings for each other to deepen and grow. Sundays were for church in the morning, followed by community gatherings or, increasingly, visits to Silverbrook Ranch, where Josephine came to know Daniel, Mrs. Flores, and the other ranch hands better. She developed a particular fondness for Bear, who seemed to consider her a welcome addition to his domain. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of the harsh Wyoming winter to come. Lancaster's trial in Cheyenne proceeded despite his lawyer's attempts to delay, with Judge Wilson traveling to testify about the attempted kidnapping and subsequent threats. On a crisp Saturday in mid-October, Matthew invited Josephine to Silverbrook for a special dinner. Mrs. Flores has been planning this meal for days, he explained when he arrived at the boarding house to collect her. She says we've been courting long enough that she should be allowed to show off her best cooking. Josephine laughed, accepting his help into the buggy he had brought instead of his usual saddle horse. I wouldn't dream of disappointing Mrs. Flores. She's become quite dear to me these past weeks. She feels the same about you, Matthew assured her as they set off toward the ranch. In fact, she's been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about weddings and grandbabies. Josephine felt her cheeks warm at the implication, though they had discussed marriage several times since that first declaration beneath the cottonwood tree. Mrs. Holloway is hardly more restrained. Just yesterday she asked if I'd given any thought to whether I'd continue teaching after I settled down. And have you? Matthew asked, his tone deliberately casual as he guided the horses onto the trail leading out of town. I have, Josephine admitted. I would like to continue, at least for a time. The children are making such progress, and there's no one else in Fort Bridger with teaching experience. I think that's a wonderful idea, Matthew said, surprising her with his immediate support. The school is as much your creation as anyone's. You should see it through at least a full year or two. You wouldn't mind having a wife who works? Josephine asked, touched by his understanding. Matthew glanced at her, his eyes warm despite the cool air around them. Josephine, I fell in love with you in part because of your dedication to education, your desire to build something meaningful. I would never ask you to abandon that. It was the first time either of them had used the word love so directly, and it hung in the air between them, momentous yet somehow as natural as breathing. I love you too, Matthew, Josephine said softly. More than I thought possible in such a short time. His hand found hers, squeezing gently before returning to the reins. We're well matched, I think, both of us building new lives after leaving our old ones behind. The remainder of the journey passed pleasantly, with Josephine sharing stories of her students' progress and Matthew updating her on the ranch's preparations for winter. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the landscape, turning the autumn-touched trees to flame along the stream banks. When they arrived at Silverbrook, Josephine was surprised to see extra care had been taken with the ranch's appearance. Fresh flowers adorned the porch, and the entire yard had been swept clean of fallen leaves. Mrs. Flores greeted them at the door, beaming with barely contained excitement. Come in, come in. Everything is ready, she announced, ushering them into the house. Inside, the table had been set with what Josephine recognized as Mrs. Flores's best china pieces she normally kept displayed in a cabinet but never used. Candles were lit despite the early hour, and the aroma of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air. This is quite an occasion, Josephine observed, glancing questioningly at Matthew. Mrs. Flores believes in celebrating properly, he replied, though something in his expression suggested there was more to the evening than he was saying. Dinner was a leisurely affair with Mrs. Flores proudly serving course after course of her finest, cooking a rich beef stew, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and finally, an apple pie that she declared was Matthew's favorite. Throughout the meal, Josephine noticed Matthew seemed slightly distracted, his usual easy conversation interrupted by moments of apparent deep thought. She wondered if something was troubling him, perhaps news from the Lancaster trial, or a problem with the ranch he hadn't mentioned. After dinner, Mrs. Flores shooed them into the sitting room, refusing Josephine's offer to help with the dishes. "No, no, you two sit by the fire. I bring coffee later." The sitting room was warm and inviting, with a fire crackling in the large stone fireplace. The bookshelves that had caught Josephine's attention on her first visit were now familiar friends, many of the volumes having made their way to the schoolhouse as loans for her more advanced students. Matthew guided Josephine to the settle near the hearth, then remained standing, his expression suddenly serious. "Josephine," he began, "I've been thinking a great deal about our future together." Her heart quickened at his tone. "So have I," she admitted. He smiled briefly, then continued. "When I first saw you on that train, standing up to Lancaster's men despite your fear, I knew you were someone extraordinary. These past 2 months have only confirmed that initial impression." Matthew moved to stand directly before her, then, to her surprise, lowered himself to one knee. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "Josephine Grayson, I love you. Your courage, your intelligence, your kindness to everyone from my ranch hands to the youngest of your students. I can't imagine my life without you in it." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had anticipated this moment might come soon, the reality of it, Matthew kneeling before her, his eyes full of love and hope, took Josephine's breath away. This man, this place, had come to mean everything to her in a remarkably short time. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that sprang to her eyes. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the firelight as he raised her hand to his lips. "I had it made in Cheyenne," he explained. "Mrs. Holloway helped me determine the size without raising your suspicions." "So she knew." Josephine laughed through happy tears. "No wonder she was so insistent I wear my best dress today." Matthew rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was different from their previous ones, deeper, more certain, a promise of the life they would build together. A discreet cough from the doorway broke them apart. Mrs. Flores stood there, a tray with coffee and small cakes in her hands and a broad smile on her face. "I see," she said. "Yes," the housekeeper observed happily. "Good. The cake I bake is for celebration, not consolation." Matthew laughed, keeping one arm around Josephine's waist. "As if there was any doubt, Mrs. Flores." "There is always doubt until there is certainty," the older woman replied wisely. "Now you have certainty and we have cake. A good evening for everyone," as they enjoyed Mrs. Flores's celebratory dessert. They began discussing practical matters: when and where they would marry, where they would live, how Josephine would balance her teaching duties with her role as Matthew's wife. "The school term ends in May," Josephine noted. "Perhaps a June wedding would be appropriate." "That seems a long time to wait," Matthew said, his eyes never leaving her face. "But it would allow proper preparation and give you a full year with your students." "And where would we live?" Josephine asked. "I could move to the ranch after we're married, but the daily journey to the schoolhouse would be challenging." "I've been thinking about that," Matthew replied. "The small house next to the church has been vacant since Reverend Hayes moved to the new parsonage. It's close to the school and in good condition. We could make it our town residence for the school term, with weekends and summers at Silver Brook." Josephine was touched by how much thought he had already given to their future together. "That sounds perfect," she agreed. "Though I hate to think of you being away from the ranch during the week." I'm in town at least 3 days a week already for various meetings and business, Matthew pointed out, and Daniel has proven himself more than capable of handling day-to-day operations. Besides, he added with a smile, some things are worth the sacrifice. Their planning was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Flores went to answer it, returning moments later with Sheriff Tanner in tow. "Sorry to intrude," the sheriff said, his expression serious beneath his customary politeness. "But there's news from Cheyenne I thought you'd want to hear right away." Matthew stood, instantly alert. "Lancaster," the sheriff nodded grimly. "The jury found him guilty on all counts. Judge sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison." Josephine felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So it's really over?" "Mostly," Sheriff Tanner qualified. "The reason I rode out here tonight is that Lancaster made some threats as they were taking him away, specifically about you two. Said he had friends who would settle accounts even if he couldn't do it personally." Matthew's expression hardened. "Any indication these are more than the empty threats of a defeated man?" "Hard to say," the sheriff admitted. "But I've put deputies on alert, and Judge Wilson suggested I warn you directly. Lancaster had connections we might not all know about." "Thank you for coming out personally," Matthew said, his arm protectively around Josephine's shoulders. "We'll be careful." After the sheriff departed, promising to keep them informed of any developments, Josephine and Matthew returned to the sitting room. The joyous mood of earlier had been tempered by the reminder of Lancaster's malevolence. "I won't let him cast a shadow over our happiness," Matthew said firmly, taking Josephine's hands in his. "Lancaster is where he belongs, and we have a future to look forward to." "You're right," Josephine agreed, forcing away the anxiety the sheriff's warning had stirred. "Nothing is going to interfere with our plans." Matthew drove her back to town later that evening, both of them agreeing that they would announce their engagement at church the following morning. The road was quiet, the night crisp and clear, with a half-moon providing enough light to see the trail clearly. "I was thinking about names," Matthew said as they neared Fort Bridger, "for the children we might have someday." The casual way he spoke of their future family warmed Josephine's heart. "What names do you like? For a boy, perhaps Thomas, after my father," Matthew replied. "And for a girl—" He hesitated, then continued softly, "maybe Elizabeth, after my mother." "Thomas and Elizabeth Irwin," Josephine tried the names aloud. "They sound perfect." They had reached the edge of town, the buildings dark except for the lights of the saloon and hotel. Matthew slowed the buggy, his expression suddenly alert. "What is it?" Josephine asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. "Probably nothing," he said, though his posture remained tense. "Just thought I saw movement near the schoolhouse." As they passed the small building that had become Josephine's domain, Matthew suddenly pulled the buggy to a halt. In the moonlight, they could see the door of the schoolhouse standing open when Josephine knew she had locked it securely after dismissing her students the previous afternoon. "Stay here," Matthew instructed, reaching beneath the seat for the rifle he kept there. "Lock the doors of the buggy." "Matthew, wait," Josephine protested. "We should get the sheriff." "His office is on the other side of town," Matthew pointed out. "If someone is vandalizing the schoolhouse, they could be gone by then." Before she could argue further, he was moving toward the building, rifle ready but not raised. Josephine watched anxiously, debating whether to follow his instructions or her own instincts, which screamed that they should seek help. A sudden flare of light from inside the schoolhouse decided her. Grabbing the small derringer that Matthew had insisted she carry since the train incident, Josephine climbed down from the buggy and moved swiftly toward the building. As she reached the door, she saw Matthew inside, confronting two men who were in the process of pouring liquid from a can onto the wooden floor. The sharp smell of kerosene reached her nostrils. "That's far enough," Matthew was saying, his rifle now trained on the men. "Step away from there and keep your hands where I can see them." One of the men complied, raising his hand slowly. The other, however, reached inside his coat. "Lancaster sends his regards," he growled. "Matthew," Josephine called in warning, but he had already seen the movement. His rifle cracked in the confined space, the sound deafening. The would-be arsonist cried out, clutching his shoulder as his concealed weapon clattered to the floor. The other man looked from his wounded companion to Matthew, clearly calculating his odds. "Don't," Matthew advised coldly. "The next shot won't be to wound." Josephine entered the schoolhouse fully now, her small derringer aimed steadily at the uninjured man. "Someone will have heard that shot," she said. "The sheriff will be here any moment." As if summoned by her words, voices could be heard approaching from the direction of the hotel. The uninjured man's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Lancaster said you'd be soft," he muttered. "Said a schoolteacher and a rancher wouldn't have the stomach for a real fight." "Lancaster was wrong about a great many things," Matthew replied, not lowering his rifle, "including who would win this particular fight." Sheriff Tanner arrived minutes later, accompanied by 2 deputies and several curious townspeople who had been roused by the gunshot. The would-be arsonists were taken into custody, the wounded man's injury treated by the town doctor before he was secured in the jail. "Looks like Lancaster's threats weren't so empty after all," the sheriff observed as they stood outside the schoolhouse. "Good thing you happened by when you did." Matthew and Josephine exchanged a glance, silently agreeing not to mention that their timely arrival had been due to their late return from his proposal. Some things were private, even in a small town where news traveled fast. "We'll need to clean up the kerosene before school on Monday," Josephine said, looking at the puddles of flammable liquid on her classroom floor. "And perhaps post a guard for a while, in case Lancaster has more friends willing to carry out his vengeance." "Already planning to," Sheriff Tanner assured her. "And I'll wire the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Let them know Lancaster is still causing trouble from behind bars. They might want to restrict his visitors." When the excitement had died down and the curious onlookers dispersed, Matthew walked Josephine to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. The landlady was waiting anxiously on the porch, having heard about the incident. "Oh, my dear girl," she exclaimed, hurrying down the steps to embrace Josephine. "When I heard there was trouble at the schoolhouse, I feared the worst." "I'm fine, Mrs. Holloway," Josephine assured her. "Thanks to Matthew." The older woman turned her attention to him, patting his arm approvingly. "You're a good man, Mr. Irwin. This town is fortunate to have you." Her gaze fell on Josephine's left hand, where the diamond ring caught the light from the porch lamp. "And is that—" Josephine smiled, extending her hand for Mrs. Holloway's inspection. "Yes, Matthew asked me to marry him this evening. I said yes." Mrs. Holloway's delight was unrestrained. "Oh, this is wonderful news. Of course, I had my suspicions when Mr. Irwin asked about your ring size, but to have it confirmed." She embraced Josephine again, then, to Matthew's evident surprise, hugged him as well. "Congratulations to you both. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," Matthew said, somewhat awkwardly patting the enthusiastic landlady's back. "We plan to announce it officially at church tomorrow." "Your secret is safe with me until then," she promised, though both Josephine and Matthew knew the news would be all over town by breakfast. "Now, come inside, both of you. After such an evening, you need hot tea and perhaps something stronger for Mr. Irwin." They accepted her hospitality gratefully, the events at the schoolhouse having left both of them shaken despite their outward composure. In the cozy parlor of the boarding house, with Mrs. Holloway bustling about providing refreshments and uttering repeated congratulations. The danger they had faced began to seem more distant. "I'm sorry our engagement evening ended with gunfire," Matthew said quietly when Mrs. Holloway had gone to the kitchen for more tea. "Don't be," Josephine replied, taking his hand. "We stopped them from burning down the schoolhouse. Besides," she added with a small smile, "it seems fitting somehow. Our relationship began with danger on that train platform. Perhaps this is simply maintaining the pattern." Matthew's laugh held equal parts amusement and relief. "I had hoped for a quieter courtship from that point forward, but you may be right." He grew serious again. "Josephine, the danger Lancaster represents is real, even from prison. If you have any doubts about our future together because of it, none whatsoever," she interrupted firmly. "Matthew Irwin, it would take far more than a vindictive cattle baron to make me reconsider marrying you. I love you, and I'm not easily frightened away from what matters to me." The conviction in her voice seemed to reassure him. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the diamond ring. "Have I mentioned lately how fortunate I am to have found you?" "Not in the last hour," Josephine teased. "But I believe actions speak louder than words, and yours this evening were quite eloquent." Mrs. Holloway returned with fresh tea and a plate of cookies, ending their private moment but not the sense of connection between them. As they shared the late-night refreshments, Josephine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point, from a sheltered life in Philadelphia to a frontier town where she had found purpose, community, and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. Whatever challenges Lancaster or others might still pose, she was certain of one thing: together, she and Matthew could face anything. The next morning, their engagement announcement at the small Fort Bridger church was met with enthusiastic approval from the congregation. Judge Wilson offered a special blessing, and even the most reserved of the townspeople came forward to congratulate them after the service. "Seems we're the talk of the town," Matthew observed as they walked toward Mrs. Holloway's for Sunday dinner. "For today," Josephine agreed. "Tomorrow there will be new gossip to occupy everyone." But she was wrong about that. Their engagement remained the primary topic of conversation in Fort Bridger for weeks, with speculation about wedding plans, living arrangements, and whether Josephine would continue teaching becoming favorite subjects for discussion over coffee at the general store or drinks at the saloon. November brought the first significant snowfall, turning the landscape into a pristine white wonderland but making travel between town and Silverbrook Ranch more challenging. Matthew stayed in town more frequently, taking a room at the hotel and spending evenings with Josephine at Mrs. Holloway's, planning their June wedding. The Christmas season brought a special excitement to both the town and the school. Josephine organized a holiday program featuring recitations and songs by her students, and nearly everyone in Fort Bridger attended, filling the small schoolhouse to capacity. After the program, Matthew presented Josephine with a special gift: the deed to the small house near the church, officially purchased and registered in both their names. "I thought we might begin preparing it for our home after the new year," he explained as she examined the document with tears of joy in her eyes. "It needs some work, but we have 6 months before the wedding." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, kissing him lightly despite the presence of numerous onlookers. After all, they were engaged now. Certain proprieties could be relaxed slightly. January and February were harsh, with blizzards that sometimes kept the schoolhouse closed for days at a time. March brought the first signs of spring, with melting snow revealing the muddy reality beneath winter's clean white blanket. Through it all, Josephine and Matthew's relationship deepened. They worked together on renovating their future home, shared meals with friends in town and at the ranch, and discussed their hopes for the years ahead. Lancaster's men had been sentenced to 10 years each for the attempted arson, and there had been no further incidents connected to the imprisoned cattle baron. By April, wedding preparations were in full swing. Mrs. Holloway appointed herself unofficial coordinator, while Mrs. Flores focused on planning the menu for the reception that would follow the ceremony. Judge Wilson would perform the service, and nearly everyone in town had some role to play, from decorating the church to providing music. May brought the end of the school year, with Josephine's students demonstrating remarkable progress during their final examinations. The town council unanimously voted to renew her contract for the following term, with a modest increase in salary that reflected their appreciation of her dedication. As June approached, Josephine found herself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed since she had first boarded that train in Philadelphia. She had arrived in Wyoming territory, a somewhat naive young woman seeking independence and purpose. She would enter her marriage a confident teacher, a respected member of her community, and a woman deeply in love with the man who had first entered her life by declaring, "She's already spoken for." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding hills. Josephine dressed in the new home she would soon share with Matthew, assisted by Mrs. Holloway and two of the older girls from her class, who had begged to be part of the preparations. Her gown was ivory silk, ordered from Denver and altered to fit perfectly by Fort Bridger's seamstress. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers, and around her throat hung a delicate gold locket, a gift from Matthew that morning, containing miniature portraits of both his parents. "You look beautiful, Miss Grayson," Emma, the youngest of her students, said solemnly as she entered with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Mr. Irwin is going to think he's dreaming." Josephine smiled, touched by the child's sentiment. "Thank you, Emma, and thank you for these lovely flowers. They're perfect." Mrs. Holloway dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I declare, I've never seen a more beautiful bride. Your parents would be so proud if they could see you today." A shadow crossed Josephine's happiness at the mention of her parents. They had declined her invitation to attend the wedding, her father still disapproving of her decision to move west and marry a rancher rather than the banker's son he had chosen. But she had received a letter from her mother the previous week, secretly wishing her happiness and enclosing a family heirloom, a small blue handkerchief that now served as something old and something blue for the wedding traditions. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Daniel, who had agreed to escort Josephine to the church in Matthew's absence. "It's time, Miss Grayson," he announced, his usual weathered face softened by a genuine smile. "Everyone's waiting, and the boss is looking like he might wear a hole in the church floor with his pacing." Josephine laughed, gathering her bouquet of roses and wildflowers. "We can't have that, can we? Lead the way, Daniel." The church was filled to capacity, with every resident of Fort Bridger in attendance and many from the surrounding ranches and homesteads as well. As Daniel led Josephine down the aisle, she saw familiar faces everywhere: her students, the merchants she visited weekly, the families she had come to know during her year in the community. And at the front, waiting beside Judge Wilson, stood Matthew. His expression as he saw her approach was everything she could have hoped for: wonder, joy, and love so evident that a murmur of approval rippled through the congregation. When Daniel placed her hand in Matthew's, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. This strong, capable man who had faced war and danger was moved to emotion by their union. His eyes, so blue and earnest, never left hers as Judge Wilson began the ceremony. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with such conviction that many in the church were visibly affected. When Matthew placed the simple gold band alongside her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and certain as he repeated the ancient promises. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Wilson declared, beaming at the couple before him. "Mr. Irwin, you may kiss your bride." Matthew's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, appropriate for the setting but conveying the depth of his feelings. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Irwin, the applause was thunderous. The reception that followed, held in the garden behind their new home, was a joyous affair that lasted well into the evening. Mrs. Flores had outdone herself with the food, and someone had brought a fiddle and harmonica for dancing. Matthew and Josephine opened the festivities with a waltz, their movements perfectly synchronized despite the uneven ground beneath their feet. "Happy, Mrs. Irwin," Matthew murmured as they circled the makeshift dance floor. "Completely," Josephine replied, savoring the sound of her new name. "And you, husband, more than I ever thought possible," he assured her, his eyes never leaving hers. "When I rode out to meet that train last year, I was just doing my duty to the town. I never imagined I was riding toward my future." "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we don't plan," Josephine observed, remembering her own trepidation as she had boarded that train in Philadelphia. As the evening progressed, they circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from everyone. Even Sheriff Tanner allowed himself to become slightly sentimental after a few cups of the punch that someone had liberally enhanced with whiskey. "Never thought I'd see the day," the lawman declared, clapping Matthew on the shoulder. The Texas Ranger who became Wyoming's most stubborn rancher, finally meeting his match in an Eastern schoolmarm. "It's a fitting end to the story." "Not an end, Sheriff," Matthew corrected with a smile. "A beginning." As night fell and lanterns were lit around the garden, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds to say their final goodbyes to Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Flores, who had overseen the reception with military precision. "The house is ready," Mrs. Holloway assured them, embracing Josephine warmly. "Everything cleaned and arranged just as you wanted. And I have left food in the kitchen for breakfast," Mrs. Flores added with a knowing smile. "You will not want to come to the ranch too early tomorrow, I think." Matthew cleared his throat, a hint of color rising in his cheeks at the housekeeper's implication. "Thank you both for everything. We couldn't have managed today without you." When they were finally alone, standing in the doorway of their new home, Matthew surprised Josephine by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained as he carried her across the threshold. "For good luck, though I think we've already been blessed with more than our share." Their home, though small by Eastern standards, was perfect for their needs. The main room was furnished with a comfortable settle before the fireplace, bookshelves already filled with volumes from both their collections, and a writing desk where Josephine could prepare her lessons. The kitchen was simple but functional, and upstairs, 2 bedrooms, the smaller one already designated as a nursery for the future, as Matthew had said when they were planning the renovations. In their bedroom, a large 4-poster bed dominated the space, with windows on either side that would catch the morning light. Someone, Mrs. Holloway, probably had scattered rose petals on the quilt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the dressing table. "Welcome home, Josephine," Matthew said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "It's perfect," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Everything I could have wished for." His kiss was different now, deeper, more passionate, without the restraint that propriety had demanded until this moment. Josephine responded in kind, her arms encircling his neck, her body molding against his in a way that felt both new and somehow inevitable. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, the sounds of the Wyoming night filtering through the slightly open window, Josephine rested her head on Matthew's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm grateful for those 3 men who tried to take me from the train," she admitted with a soft laugh. "Without them, we might never have met." Matthew chuckled, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. "I prefer to think we would have found each other eventually. Some things are meant to be, train bandits or no." "Perhaps you're right," Josephine agreed, tilting her head to look at his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "But I'm still thankful for the path that led me here to you, to this life we're building together." "As am I," Matthew said, drawing her closer. "More thankful than I have words to express." Words gave way to touches, to kisses, to the wordless communication of 2 people deeply in love, beginning the journey of a lifetime together. 1 year later, on a bright June morning that mirrored their wedding day, Josephine stood on the porch of their home, watching as Matthew approached from the direction of the schoolhouse. In her arms, 2-month-old Thomas slept peacefully, unaware of the excitement his existence had generated in Fort Bridger. "How was the last day of school?" Matthew asked, climbing the steps to join his family. "Bittersweet," Josephine admitted. "The children have made so much progress this year. I'll miss them during the summer." "And they'll miss you," Matthew assured her, gently touching their son's downy head. "Though I suspect many of them will find reasons to visit, just to see how Master Thomas is growing." Josephine smiled, leaning into her husband's embrace as they gazed out at the town that had become their home. Fort Bridger had grown over the past year, with new buildings rising along the main street and more families settling in the area. The school would need an additional teacher next term to accommodate the increasing number of students. "Have you heard from the lawyer in Philadelphia?" Matthew asked, referring to the correspondence that had arrived the previous week. "Yes, this morning," Josephine replied. "My father's will has been settled. He left everything to my mother for her lifetime, with provisions for me afterward." Her father had died suddenly 3 months earlier, never having met his grandson or reconciled with his daughter's choices. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked gently, knowing the complicated grief she felt for a parent who had loved her but never fully accepted her independence. "I am," Josephine assured him. "My mother writes that she may visit in the autumn, once Thomas is a bit older. She's curious about this Wyoming territory that claimed her only child." "She'll always be welcome," Matthew said. "As will you, little one," he added, carefully taking his son from Josephine's arms. "Though I suspect you'll grow up to be more cowboy than banker, much to your grandfather's posthumous dismay." Josephine laughed, watching as Matthew cradled their child with the same tenderness he had shown her from their first meeting. "I think he'll be like his father, a man of principle, willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And like his mother, intelligent, courageous, and determined to make a difference," Matthew added, his eyes warm with love as he gazed at his wife. Together, they entered their home, a family forged in the crucible of the Wyoming frontier, a schoolteacher from the East, a rancher with a complex past, and their son, born to a legacy of love and resilience. Outside, Fort Bridger continued to grow and thrive, but within these walls was everything that truly mattered: love, security, and the promise of a shared future. And it had all begun with a confrontation on a train platform, with 3 men trying to take her away, and a cowboy stepping forward to declare, "She's already spoken for."